Hi guys, my name is Deanna Sianias, and we will be covering the structures, hormones, processes, milestones, and challenges of human growth and development, basically being from birth to death. You will see my citations at the bottom of each slide, and then also at the very end. Okay? So this is an overview of our life stages. We start with the prenatal stage and we end with late adulthood. In between, we see infancy, early, middle, and late childhood, adolescence, and then early, middle, and late adulthood. And then, of course, our focus today, we're basically going to talk about physical development, milestones that we reach, and major changes that we witness as we age. Okay, so in the prenatal stage, which is from conception to birth, we start to see physical structures going from the zygote to the morula to the blastocyst in stages. And then, of course, the implementation would be the placenta, the chorion, amnion, and of course, we start to see the development of fetal circulation. Our HCG hormones start to become active, progesterone and estrogen start to appear, and HPL, relaxin, starts to occur. And then, of course, there is fetal thyroid and cortisol surfactant. In the processes that we're talking about, we see organogenesis happening between weeks 3 and 8. And then, of course, fetal growth starts to witness some very critical periods, right? And then we also start to talk a little bit about teratogens. So basically, this is kind of like the development of the fetus to become, an actual like baby. And then, of course, some of the challenges that we might witness here during that development would be the sustaining of a heartbeat between weeks 5 and 6 of development, sex differentiation, and then of course you might run the risk of like premature births, HIN, or developing disease and things such as like diabetes risk. Okay, so in infancy, which is pretty much the first month of the first year to 2 years, or 0 to 2 years actually, we start to see changes in structure again, which includes rapid myelination and synaptogenesis or pruning. And then of course we start to see that the fontanelles are the primary definition. So basically, we start to see that the child is developing not just as a physical baby anymore, but is also developing the understanding of their self and motor skills and, building up all that kind of stuff. So in hormonal stages, in infancy, in the hormonal aspect, we start to see GH and IGF-1 activity, and then of course there's thyroid hormones, and then the vitamin D and PTH, calcium balance, right? Some milestones to consider in this stage. Children will start to sit down on their own within 6 months, crawl within 9 months, and then walk within 12 to 15 months. And then, of course, their first words are usually expected around the 12-month area. Fun fact, bilingual babies might actually have a delay. And then, of course, your challenges, right? You might see FTT, iron deficiency, or congenital thyroid and heart disease. And then, of course, that's when you also start to see a regular vaccine schedule for children. All right, so when we're talking about early childhood, between 3 and 5 years, we start to see continued myelination, and then of course more fine motor expansion. This is when you start to like see children, practicing using like spoons and forks, and then of course the growing rate slows. The growth rate slows in children, right? So some of the milestones to consider at this point: children will start to hop and skip. They can start learning, not just like drawing and dexterity, but also like how to ride a tricycle, or, start completing their toilet training. And then, of course, you start to see your language growth really happen here. Some of the challenges you might experience would be obesity prevention, sleep hygiene, and vision or hearing does have to be regularly screened at this stage. In middle to late childhood, which is between the ages of 6 to 12, then we start to see the child no longer being of like an infant stage, but now they're starting to reach adolescence. So they're starting to see more long bone endochondral ossification, and they start to see more growth plates. Their immune system is starting to mature. And then, of course, there are, milestones in coordination and endurance. So basically here we see an upward development of permanent teeth, and pre-adolescent growth acceleration. Some challenges in this point would include scoliosis, or being prone to scoliosis. So you'll have regular checks, especially in school systems. And then, of course, there's, things to look out for like injury prevention and, really making sure that they have the right nutrition for bone and muscle mass. Okay, so here we're starting to see adolescence stages, which is between the age of 13 and 18, preteen to teen, rather teen years more specifically. And then we also see HPG axis ignition. Here you can kind of see this little diagram showing that, but basically you're starting to see the development of secondary sex characteristics, which is including, physical characteristics that come with puberty, and then you start to see peak height velocity. Peak height velocity as in like their actual height. But of course, there are some structures and terms to consider: the menarche, the sperm arc, and then of course, you start to see plate closures, their skeletal structure, their muscular structure is becoming more developed, more mature. And then you might see at this point in a child's time that they'll witness, their most notable growth spurts. It is known that girls will have them earlier than boys. And then, of course, you'll start to see more fertility onset and bone mineral accrual. Okay, so like if a child breaks their bone during this stage, more than likely it can actually heal a little bit, faster in this stage, but it doesn't mean that it's 100%, right? So anyway, that's a fun fact as well. Some challenges you might witness would be anemia in menstruating teens, acne, sleep phases start to shift, and then of course you can see things like stress fractures, and the development of the adolescent mind, right? That sounds like a risk, but let's continue. Early adulthood. This is going to be from ages, from the 19 to early 20s. This is when our physiology is reaching its peak. We start to get a better reaction time, our cognitive speed is much faster, and then our bone mass peaks at our late 20s. So this is probably going to be like, your most immature stage of adulthood. But we do start to see really awesome milestones like bone consolidation, full-on reproductive health and lifestyle patterns, meaning that, more than likely the early adult in this stage has developed self-awareness and an independence. And then, of course, you still have your challenges such as injury prevention and all that, but then you also start to see a little bit more metabolic risk. And then, of course, this is also the stage where you would ideally talk about contraception or fertility planning, but it's never, a bad idea to start earlier, right? And then, of course, when we talk about middle adulthood, this is going to be in our 30s to 60s. So this is when the adult has reached their peak, and basically we start to see sarcopenia onset and reduced vascular skin elasticity, presbyopia basically. So for sex-specific things, we see premenopause and menopause happening in those later years. And then, of course, we see estrogen and progesterone going up. So these kind of sound like the bad things, right? Towards the later part of adulthood, our bone density does start to decline, our GFR slowly declines, and then our metabolic risk goes up. But you have to remember that in your 30s, this is going to be more than likely, your late 20s, early 30s, the prime, right? So consider all of these, processes, kind of at their moment where you should be taking care of them the most, right? Like in your late 20s, early 30s, this is when you really want to focus on being at the peak health that you can achieve. And then, of course, taking into account the risks that you might have, such as like, diabetes or high cholesterol or things like that, and taking early action so you don't face so many risks as you go into your later adulthood life. And then, of course, you also see, that screenings might become more regular. You might want to talk more about like preventions for, whatever it may be that you are prone to based on, like your lineage, rather, stuff like that, or environment factors to consider. So yeah. Okay, I hope that made sense. So in your late adulthood, which is 61 and older, this is basically when you start seeing aging in the physiological level. Um, so again, processes like sarcopenia, dynapenia, osteopenia, osteoporosis, these start to, we start to talk about these more. And then in immunosenescence, we start to see slower gastric mobility. Our sleep architecture changes as well, which means, we have to physically sleep differently. We have to mentally prepare ourselves for sleep and wellness differently. And our neuroplasticity is still persistent, but it is slower. So now we have to start exercising the brain more. We have to consider, like our vitamins. We have to consider, again, lifestyle changes to kind of adjust to our late adulthood needs. And then, of course, we start to see, our hormones start to kind of lower a little bit. So our GH and our IGF-1. And then, of course, even things like sex steroids, variable thyroid, and an up in insulin resistance are things that we start to clinically talk about. Per patient, depends. And then, of course, our challenges may include, starting to lose that sort of fortitude in our bodies. So we witness more falls. We start to see more polypharmacy, sensory loss, and then you are at a risk of depression, isolation, more so at this age. So, these are things that we do consider. All right, so then age-linked challenges and screening pearls, right? When we're talking about pediatrics, we're just kind of going down the line, okay? When we're talking about pediatrics, you want to consider vaccines, regular vaccines. You want to consider your, hearing and vision checks, and you want to go ahead and make sure that you're on par with those growth charts, whether it be physical, in language, in, like these milestones that you have to reach. For adolescents, we start to talk more about mental health, injury prevention, physical, like things like sports, or, like doing, random child things. And then, of course, your iron status, believe it or not. And then for adults, we start to talk about things like, like lipid control and glucose control. And then, of course, this is when we start to do cancer screening scheduling, bone health scheduling for screenings, postmenopause talk, basically just, not only your frequent everyday kind of check-ins, but also, in your early part of adulthood, you're basically revving yourself up to have that sustainability and that, health that will take you into a very, or at least the calmest, later adulthood that we want, right? So you're starting to manage your nutrition, you're starting to manage your, lifestyle, your stress levels, what you do for work, external and internal factors that will pretty much determine what your later adulthood life is going to look like, right? And then, of course, in late life, this is when we start to wind those down a bit. This is when we start to, reevaluate how we're living our lives and how it's safe or helpful for us. So, like because we start to see more cognition difficulties in later life, we start to talk more about different treatments for that and different lifestyle habits for that. The same with like hearing and vision, you want to start screening that again. And then you want to do like medication reviews, you want to do a wellness review. I mean, usually an older person, for example, cannot run a mile the same way a younger person can. And, these are just some differences that we sometimes have to talk about. And it's not to say that they don't know, it's just to say, there are new risks in the late life stages. All right, so I hope that I covered everything. Yeah, and then these are my references. They are in APA 7th. I did use our, textbook for this class as one of the main resources, but I also referred to the National Institute of Aging, which was really informative, really awesome. They even offer things like on learning pedagogy and, like processes of development in the mental stages, so that's really awesome. And then, of course, there's the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Endocrine Society for, the older stuff, and then, of course, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention is definitely a staple. So Thank you guys so much, and have a wonderful rest of your semester. I hope you enjoyed. Bye-bye.